Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome back to Clearer Than Truth. I'm Nathan Kiker, here with my co-host, George Bogden. Joining us today is Julian Zelizer, professor of history and public affairs at Princeton, CNN political analyst, and author of numerous landmark books on modern American political history. Julian's work offers an indispensable look at how domestic institutional dynamics, congressional warfare, and party polarization influence foreign policy and statecraft. Today, we're talking through modern political polarization and its cascading impacts on American grand strategy. Julian, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
You wrote a book in 2025 on the defense of partisanship. I think if you asked anyone in Georgia, Florida, D.C., anywhere in the U.S., no one is happy with partisanship. Tell us about the book. What is the defense of partisanship?
Yeah, it was a history of how parties have been central to our country from the founding right through today, even though the founders didn't want parties and didn't like them. So it's kind of a pragmatic look that we've had these institutions. I think they've served a lot of important functions, and they continue to do that today. They're a way in which different perspectives in this country can be expressed through the political system as opposed to around it. It's a mechanism to organize different coalitions around key themes. But I also try to look at kind of what's gone wrong and ways in which partisanship changed a lot after the 1990s and ended up moving in some destructive ways. So it's an attempt to look at an institution and its benefits to kind of push us, hopefully, in a better direction.
I think when most people think of partisanship, they think about the fact that we haven't passed many budgets in the last 20 years, that you put people like Nancy Mace as committee chairs who are fanatics, or on the left, you put people like, AOC, I don't think she's a chair, but people like her. How can a democracy actually function when you have politely lunatic fringe characters in charge of Congress and these committee chairs? People who are rewarded based on how much they raise for their party, not on their legislative acumen.
Well, first I'd look backward as I do as a historian, and I always remember that some of the really transformative moments in American politics, whether you're talking about Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal or Ronald Reagan and the 1980s, parties were really quite central. And you don't get an FDR and that vision without the Democratic Party and the coalition it had put together. You don't get Ronald Reagan in the 1980s without the way the GOP changed after Nixon and brought in new voters, evangelicals, and neoconservative Democrats and others. So they've been really important. And I think, look, I talk in the book about lots of changes that can make parties healthier. But one very basic thing, and I know it's amorphous, but I believe it's more important than ever, is the embrace and acceptance of certain guardrails in the leadership as to what you are willing to do in partisan battle and how far you're willing to go. And we lived a lot of the history of this country with very hardened partisans who didn't agree on a lot, abiding by that because they understood that democratic institutions need to be nurtured. They understood governing is a principle. So I have procedural reforms I think would be helpful, but at the biggest level, I have come to believe that's something we have lost and needs to be reinserted at the top.
It certainly seems that way. You do point out that partisanship is not necessarily an albatross if congressional reforms happen with it. It seems that those reforms are not going to happen. If that's the case, is our current system completely cooked?
It's not completely cooked, and it still functions, and we still do barely, but we get budgets and decisions are made. But no, this is not a good. I am not someone who believes this is a good state of being. I don't blame the parties for everything. I think it goes much more broadly than that in terms of some of the dysfunction. But ultimately, look, you need three institutions that defend their prerogatives aggressively in a good way. I don't think we're seeing that right now on Capitol Hill. We need legislators who care as much about governing as they do about maintaining partisan power. And that is not what we're seeing at this time. And ultimately, we also need parties where the party officials, candidates, politicians are integrated and connected to voters. What we have now, many people agree, is intense partisanship, but a disconnect between the mechanisms of the party and the people. I think you see this in both Republican and Democratic politics, a sense of frustration about this. So I think those are areas that we need to really focus on if we are going to move in a good direction. I'd just add one last thing, is that the idea of reform and government reform is not an impossible dream. We have gone through periods in this country in the progressive era, the early 20th century, where you get the direct election of senators, you get disclosure laws on campaign finance. And then in the 70s, in the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate, you have lots of reforms. Some work, some don't, from campaign finance to budget reform. But you do have a focus on that issue. And I do think we are going to need a period where that happens. When it happens, I don't know. I'm not a prognosticator, nor am I convinced it's around the corner. But I think that's the kind of attention that will be needed to really repair the system, rather than waiting for one president or congressional leader to magically change everything.
We're talking to George Packer in about a month, who I believe drew on a lot of your work, and you both focus on Newt Gingrich in the 90s. Yeah. What specifically did Gingrich do to break the system?
Well, he was a new generation that was very different than the Republicans of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And he believed quite explicitly that partisan power did have to be the priority. And what's really remarkable about his career, and Republican leaders understood this about him and at first kept him at arm's length, was a willingness to go very far in terms of his rhetoric, in terms of weaponizing basic procedures in politics, and stoking distrust rather than pushing against it, as integral to how Republicans at that time were going to reclaim power on Capitol Hill. And you've always had kind of bomb throwers, so to speak, in Congress, mavericks. But what made Gingrich different, obviously, is he's elevated in the late 80s after bringing down the Speaker of the House, Jim Wright, to the position of minority whip. And in 94, that style of Republican partisanship becomes the way the leadership worked. And I think at this point, there's been many generations, and you've seen a more of a kind of radicalized vision of partisanship. But he was really at the forefront and spoke a lot. You know, he was disparaging of bipartisanship. He was disparaging of civility. He said openly, that's not how you win power. And I think there was a big cost to that.
How do we compare to other advanced countries when it comes to how our legislative process is working and how it's supposed to work? Is this also the process in other China's different, but in a place like China, Singapore, Germany, are we more chaotic? Are we more dysfunctional? Or are we just on par?
There's lots of dysfunction to go around. I mean, autocratic systems are certainly profoundly not only inhumane and brutal, but dysfunctional. And you see populations live without basic means. You're seeing that in a range of countries right now. This was part of the story of Venezuela, for example. You're seeing in Cuba. Obviously, it's connected to embargoes, but it's also a product of the system. You have many parliamentary systems. Look at England. Where it's a parliamentary system in contrast to what we have. But, you know, you have a leader every week, it feels like, and they're not able to resolve certain basic issues about government spending and priorities. So I think, look, we're not in a great state. It doesn't mean we're exceptional. And I think a lot of countries are struggling with their political systems, and they're struggling with some of the same issues we've seen here in the last 20 years, from the way social media has changed, the way our politics works, to growing pre-committed obligations in the budget. Here, Social Security, Medicare, and the military are three of the really big ones. And finally, debates and tensions over issues like immigration. These are not U.S. centered, and I think they're affecting political systems that are very different all over the world.
I want to jump in on this, Nathan, because, I think I mean, I agree with you that Gingrich was this profound figure in American history. I mean, when he used the expression, "This is a wildly historic night," when in the 1990s he finally wrested control of the House of Representatives from the Democratic Party. I mean, I think it's sort of forgotten among people in my generation that for decades upon decades, that chamber had been controlled solely by one party. And that kind of stagnation, I would say, the prerogatives of one part of government just being inherently controlled by one party, that was a kind of dysfunction unto itself, right? Would you agree with me on that, or do you think that he, en masse, there was more damage that he did, or so on?
I mean, I, as a historian, I'm not necessarily assessing it that way. I'm trying to trace the history. I think point one that you raised is very important. And many of my students are flabbergasted when they learn that Democrats controlled Congress from 1955 to 1995. And even before that, Republicans barely had control after 1930, just 2 sessions. And in the 80s, they controlled the Senate. So that is a precondition. It's what led a lot of moderate Republicans who didn't like Gingrich at all, who were terrified of what he was doing, to vote for him in the leadership because they wanted to reclaim power. So that's point one. I think that is the context. And that was Gingrich's promise. The promise was do anything, say anything, because that's the only way we're going to break the power of Democrats. Was that multi-era dysfunctional? Look, people are going to disagree. It certainly was not a perfect majority. There were many problems with campaign finance, corruption. I've written a lot about that, and it often led Democrats to push for reforms, including in the 70s. But it was also a very formidable coalition that Democrats put into place, diverse. I mean, students also forget you had Southern Democrats who were very conservative on issues of race, and Northern liberals like Hubert Humphrey, who somehow were in the same group. And it was a formidable coalition. And that's another reason it lasted so long. And we have not seen that since 94. I mean, it's a big change in politics that we have shifting majorities and we have very narrow majorities. So, look, of course, there is dysfunction. I think it was more than that, and people can conclude what they want. And then the second question is, but then what do you do? And what were some of the costs of the style that Gingrich introduced to re-seize power? And I'll let readers kind of grapple with that over time.
I don't want this question to seem simplistic or rude to current leaders, but were our leaders in the 20th century smarter than the leaders today? It seems to be the case that we're electing the lowest common denominator, not the highest. Is that just a hunch, or is that backed up through stats or effectiveness or anything else historically?
I don't know if there's a statistical study of that or how you would actually gauge it. Look, I've met many legislators today and policymakers in both parties who are very smart and certainly would stand up with people of yesteryear. And I've studied many people from yesteryear who are not particularly smart, or they're unethical, or they would fall under the categorization you're talking today. I do think there's challenges the current political ecosystem causes that doesn't always bring out the smart in smart people. I do think I'm one who thinks social media has really degraded our public discourse and our common space in politics. And so you have incentives for elected officials today to speak in ways that are provocative, sensational, attention-getting. That doesn't mean they're not smart, but it leads them to a style of political debate that I don't think elevates who we are as a democracy and diminishes it. I do think one other part to connect to the last question is, because majorities on Capitol Hill are so narrow. My colleague Francis Lee wrote about this, and they shift so much. In contrast to that earlier period, both parties, as smart as you might be, have an incentive to really kind of play to the worst elements of partisanship, because you want to hold on to power. You don't want to give your opponent a single thing, because that might mean next Congress you're out of power. So that and other structural issues matter. So maybe I'm an optimist, but I still meet people I admire, and I think they're still there. And I think maybe the question is, how do you bring that out of them, of the best leaders we have in both parties on Capitol Hill and in presidential politics or at the state level, and B, how do you recruit a new generation? That's where I worry, because of the toxicity of politics and the dysfunction. I just meet so many students or young people who aren't my students, who the last thing they want to do is get into politics, even if they're civic minded, even if they care about public issues. I'd rather go into private finance and raise money for causes. I want to work in nonprofits. But that next generation, I think, is going to be really, really important to making sure we don't move in the direction that you're talking about.
Fascinating. It seems that Congress has ceded a ton of power to the executive branch. I don't think anyone disagrees about that. When did that begin? When did that begin, and what is the effect of that? Once Congress sort of hands power to the president, can it ever get it back? Has it ever happened, or is it gone forever, like sand in a sand glass? I specifically think about President Obama with immigration. There is, of course, a ton of criticism that his acting unilaterally on things like DACA might be unconstitutional, but it always struck me that that was just in response to Congress's giving him a really long leash by not doing oversight, not allocating resources to immigration reform or to ICE. Can the legislative branch ever claw back power from the executive branch once it's handed over? And has that happened before?
Well, the important thing to remember, and I think commentary on President Trump often makes this mistake, is he certainly didn't invent very strong presidential power. This is a story we've had at least since the early 20th century. In 1973, there was a book by a historian, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., called The Imperial President, and it was about the aftermath of Johnson and Nixon and realizing how much power had been given to the executive branch. And Schlesinger himself had been a proponent of that under FDR and Kennedy because he thought liberalism benefited from a strong president. So the story of the imperial presidency, of growing executive power, is a multi-decade story. We saw it with President Bush, George W. after 9/11, vast expansion of executive power for national security. And the examples you're talking about with President Obama, you saw it with Clinton, you saw it with Biden. Executive power is something that keeps growing. And I think for me, I see President Trump capitalizing on it rather than creating it. He expands it in many ways. The court has supported him in many ways, but he's building on something that's been kind of defining element of our political history for a while now, and many people have worried about that on the left and right, frankly. Can Congress retake power? Yes. I mentioned earlier the era of the 1970s, which is a very important era of reform, and most of the reforms were about just that. And some of the reforms worked, some didn't. I think the budget reform of 1974, which we often hear about via reconciliation, has had an effect of making Congress more unified as it deals with the budget and more centralized than it was in the period before. Although it's been allowed to expire and was very controversial, the independent counsel law that was put on the books in 78 that created basically an autonomous office to investigate executive branch corruption was it wasn't giving power to Congress, but it certainly took power away from the executive branch. And disclosure laws on financial issues and ethics are still on the books from the 70s. So Congress can do it. And they've not used their power. I don't think they've given it all away. It's really a matter of, do you have a majority that is going to assert and insist in some areas that Congress is dominant? The biggest area we saw it, I'm sorry, one last thing. In the 70s, one big reform with the budget was impoundment. And Congress was frustrated with President Nixon, who was using the impoundment power much more aggressively than earlier presidents had done. And that's becoming, and they passed the budget reform, which limits impoundment. We're now back in a debate about that because President Trump has used it more aggressively again. So there's a history of doing it. And I just, as I said earlier, I can't predict if or when that will happen, but it's certainly something Congress could do if they focused on that.
Correct my memory, and then I'll hand it to George. But impoundment, is that when you just don't spend the money that you're given, or is that when you move money allocated to something else?
You don't spend money that Congress has appropriated. And so presidents have done this throughout American history. And the issue Nixon raised, he used it. There was a clean water program, for example, that he actually signed into law, but he didn't support, and he wouldn't spend it. And usually it had been used if a program was somewhat outdated or Congress allocated much more money than ended up being needed. The difference started to become impounding just not to do what Congress said. And that's a direct attack, I think, on congressional prerogative.
In legislative speak, I don't want to filibuster, so I want to hand it to Dr. Bogden. And George, actually, I want to phrase this to you as a question. And you worked in the executive branch. Did you ever think about Congress? And then I'll hand you your question, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we thought about Congress all the time when I was serving in the executive branch, in large part because at that time, I was involved with implementing the President's America First trade policy. And there was a great deal of effort put into trying to look at the extent to which this authority to implement tariffs had actually been conferred on the president. And, I think an element of our conversation that has not surfaced yet is about the Supreme Court, in part because, the administration was trying to make as bulletproof as possible its tariff agenda. And, we can squabble about the validity of the ruling of the court, but, Congress essentially, if you're looking at, how they typically intervene on foreign policy issues, remain silent and ceded the ground to the president, essentially consenting to the use of these authorities, despite their extraordinary potential influence and a great deal of pressure and outcry from certain elements of the public, right? And so, I wonder about that element of the partisanship conversation, right? I mean, does it produce a more activist and, forceful Supreme Court? Is that good? Is it bad? How do you see that as an element of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's not unlike executive power. I mean, there is an argument that as polarization became stronger and both parties lost the center, and on Capitol Hill, it's much harder to find legislation that is going to work on a bipartisan basis, which in the Senate means you're not going to get legislation because of the filibuster. On executive power, the argument has been that's why presidents in both parties use executive power so much. That's why Obama did it. That's why President Trump will do it. It's either because it's easier, or it's literally the only way to deal with issues that presidents reach the decision can't wait any longer. So you can pick whether it's tariffs, climate, that's for everyone else, but that's the logic. And I think there is an element that is now related to the courts, and you're hearing that too. I'm forgetting the very good commentator who writes about the court, Sarah Isgur. I can't remember her name. She has a very good book out, but she often makes that argument that if you want to stop having such an activist court, have Congress respond to these issues and pass legislation to deal with what the court is now often dealing with. That's separate than do you have a very activist court? That's a whole other question. I don't think it's directly related you could have a very partisan Congress that doesn't produce much, but you could still have a court that's not going to solve it for them. I do think right now you have a court that is pretty forceful in pushing forward on certain areas beyond what some legal experts believe precedent allows for. And I think that's an important issue for the country. But ultimately, it's a congressional issue, because there you get back to who do voters vote for in the Senate, which is really the only way I think that you deal with that.
Yeah. I'm also struck, by some examples that we might choose from in terms of, partisan intervention in foreign policy. I mean, I look at the War Powers Act as really kind of a Democratic Party kind of experiment, right, to try to constrain future presidents from, engaging in these sort of actions abroad. And, you can argue that it was whittled down by various presidents, but I think most dramatically by President Obama when, he essentially had his legal advisor argue that we weren't engaged in hostilities in Libya because there were only bullets, going in one direction. I mention this just because it seems as though, with regard to foreign policy, when you have a kind of partisan intervention to kind of try to constrain presidential power, it's really only doomed to failure. Am I misthinking? Am I thinking about that incorrectly, or?
Well, yeah. I don't. One reminder is that even the reform of '73, the War Powers Resolution, was pushed by a very conservative Southern Democrat who, in today's world, would be a Republican. And we have to remember that when we say it's not a liberal Democratic initiative at all. It was bipartisan in that you had very conservative voices, institutionalists joining with liberals after Vietnam to reassert it. And it was a response not just to Vietnam, but since Korea in 1950, Congress doesn't declare war anymore. The problem's gotten worse. I do think, look, Congress tried to set timetables and schedules. It is true that presidents still, until now, felt the need generally to request support from Congress, which I think sometimes is underestimated as an important outcome of reform, meaning you had to make a case at least about why you were going to send troops. President Bush, and controversially, did that with Iraq. And this isn't about the debate of should we have done it, but he at least felt that pressure still, which I don't think we have anymore, to go to that Capitol Hill and to go to those legislators and build some kind of domestic coalition. There's been many stages since then. Certainly many point to Obama. Many will talk about Iran, where we haven't even had that at all, and talk about how degraded. But again, doesn't mean it can't work. It's more whether we have, it's not going to be formally forced, but does Congress use the authority it has, whether it's through the War Powers Resolution, which they have tried to pass, one coalition has, or the budget power. Right now, they're dealing with a budget where that's the ultimate power Capitol Hill still really has, that they can use it. And there's ways to constrain a president if they want to.
Legislatively, Barack Obama had it fairly easy. He had massive majorities for 2 years, and he could just ram through healthcare and everything else. But you wrote one of the definitive academic books on President Biden a couple of years ago, or recently. He, despite not really having large majorities, seemed to have quite a bit of legislative success. What made him uniquely able to achieve that? It seems simplistic to say, oh, just because he was in the Senate for 36 years. I think he had something else figured out. How was he able to get Congress to work with the presidency better than Obama, Trump, etc.?
Yeah, some of it is he had a Congress, a Democratic majority that was very eager to work with him. And it was the aftermath of the first Trump presidency. And a lot of anger helped to unite the party in a way that was beneficial to Biden, then asking them for legislation. And overall, the divisions were pretty minor. Within the Democratic caucus, obviously, you had certain figures like Senator Manchin, who the president really had to focus on. But they had a united party. They had a very energized party. And they had a party that I think felt more desperate to deal with issues after they had seen power slip away from them and move in a very different direction. I think Biden did pick issues generally which didn't fragment the Democratic Party early on. He avoided some, and many would argue to his detriment, such as immigration issues. But he dealt with infrastructure. He dealt with COVID, which built on President Trump's legislation, so it wasn't kind of brand new in terms of dealing with it through federal spending. And the climate, which he did in a way that wasn't directly a climate bill, but I think it was packaged in a way he had support. So I think he found ways to push for bills that would keep that unity going. He was very insistent on making federal money available in red and blue states. Political move. FDR did stuff like that too. I think it could have been savvy. It matters that he was in Congress. I am someone who believes that there's a value of not only knowing how the institution works, but knowing the players. And I do think that was beneficial, including his tense relationships with the Manchin, for example. But in itself, a very seasoned person can really struggle in this kind of atmosphere as well. So those are the two. But look, the book looks at many failures and costs, which ultimately undermine what could have been a huge legislative legacy.
Do you think our founders would be happy with the amount of power both Congress and the presidency have today, or did they envision something different?
No, I mean, I look, this is something people debate, but I do believe a balance of power was pretty fundamental. And I don't think, not all of them, their founders are different and they had different perspectives. But when I look back, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, it's hard for me not to see that the legislative branch was meant to be very central and very powerful, and we would not have an imperial presidency. I can't square those two realities, where we are and what the founders said. Look, there's an argument. Okay, that's fine. Times have changed. Politics have changed. And that's what we need today. But it isn't in the spirit, in my opinion, of what the founders were trying to craft. We've moved in a really different direction, and a direction that, even if necessary, brings up some of the problems the founders were envisioning in a very different world that could happen if this balance wasn't achieved.
A final question. You seem bullish that our institutions are not broken. They may be bruised. What gives you hope that we can continue to have a functioning legislative process and democracy as we head into the next 25 years of this century?
Fair question. I'm a very optimistic person by nature. I'm a New York Jets fan my whole life, so I have literally spent decades.
You survived Mark Sanchez's butt
but
fumble.
I'm also
so you
a
have
Knicks fan, so now I feel even like things can change. But look, I just look, the long arc of history has many incredibly not only problematic but destructive periods, like the Civil War as the prime example. And our institutions have shown not a resilience. They can be rebuilt. It's more about the citizenry. And it just strikes me how many moments we've had, the Jim Crow South, I can go through the list, where we've moved in a direction of building stronger institutions and repairing institutions. So for me, it's not inevitable. I'm optimistic, but I don't think it's not going to involve an incredible amount of work and courage and determination to happen. But the history shows that it can happen. I do believe that the bones of the country are very strong, and that the constitutional system is kind of capable of a lot, and it's proved that. It's not speculation. So. And then look, finally, I spend my life with young people, and I always understand many people are down on younger generations, but I'm just always inspired by them. I mean, they don't have always the total cynicism of my generation, and teaching them and engaging in dialogue with them, for me, whether it's in the classroom or giving talks, just creates an optimism about where things can go. Again, none of this is meant to discount real big problems I write about. I see dangers that the democracy faces, but I believe that we can move in the right direction.
Julian, your optimism is inspiring as we head into the weekend. Where can our listeners continue to follow your really great work?
I have a Substack called The Long View, and that's the best way to see me. And I write a column for Foreign Policy where I try to bring history to understand contemporary issues. So that are my books. But thank you for following, and thank you for having me on. This is a terrific conversation with both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with your friends.